in order to even sit down and have a beautiful bottom-up reconstruction. What do we want our priorities to be? None of this can be done before abolition. I'm talking about colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, patriarchy. These structures have to go. So now we are at revolution. Hey, I'm Dr. Hall, the creative director of Wake Productions. And today I'm going to teach a Reconstruction 101. What happened during the Reconstruction period? This was the post-Civil War period from 1865 to 1877 in the U.S. South. It is where the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution come from, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And it was something that we need to talk about now because everything that came out of that period is being dismantled. And it's crucial to know how people have fought for their freedom and things that have been successful. And so much of what happened during Reconstruction was inspiring. And I feel like if it had been allowed to succeed, we would live in a very different country now. But it was dismantled. And now we are going back to this period of brutal white supremacist domination. When the Voting Rights Act was gutted, that was basically the end of the 15th Amendment. And so it's important to talk about this now. A couple of notes on terms. First of all, I'm going to be talking about Democrats and Republicans a lot. And please understand this was a different historical period. The Republican Party was new. They were formed actually in the fight against slavery. And the Democrats were the very conservative forces at this time. So don't get that confused. Other thing I think would be good to just do a quick overview of is just briefly the structure of the government in terms of understanding that there are three branches of the federal government: the legislative branch, which is Congress, the executive branch, president, and the judicial branch, the courts. The period of Reconstruction is usually taught starting at the end of Civil War, which ended in 1865. People who study the period, who are specialists in the period, we understand the period from, John Brown's Harper's Ferry through the Civil War and up to the end of Reconstruction, 1877, which I'll get to in a minute. We call that entire period emancipation. For the purposes of this, I'm going to use the typical high school style, and we're going to start at the end of the war, end of Civil War, okay? So the war ends in 1865. The 13th Amendment is ratified in December 1865. That is the end of slavery in the United States. It is not the Emancipation Proclamation, because that only applied to areas where Lincoln had no jurisdiction. There were Union slave states like Delaware and Maryland where slavery was still legal. It was still legal in D.C. after the Emancipation Proclamation. So the real end of slavery was when the 13th Amendment was enacted. The 13th Amendment has two sections. Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, the big exception, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And the other thing it says is that Congress shall have the power to enforce this article with appropriate legislation. You'll see in a minute why that's important, because a lot of these things that the federal government tried to do during Reconstruction were new powers that the federal government had never had, didn't exist before, and were created specifically to address the incredible rise of white supremacist violence after the Civil War and the attempt to roll back and basically reinstantiate slavery by another name. Two phases: presidential Reconstruction, or Johnsonian Reconstruction, and then congressional Reconstruction. Let's start with the first phase. So President Johnson, from 1865 to 1867, he was a unionist. He was more of a Southern Democrat. He was a complete states' rights advocate and a racist. His goal was to restore the pre-Civil War South as close as possible, given the 13th Amendment. So he appointed provisional governments in the South made up of former slaveholders. State legislatures enacted black codes. So now let's talk about what a black code is. Because the 13th Amendment has that exception that slavery is allowed if it's punishment for a crime, then the southern states, after the Civil War, just made it illegal for black people to do anything. There were vagrancy laws. If you're not gainfully employed, which at that point meant working for a white person, you could go to jail. And then you had to work for free. State judges could take black children who weren't being supported adequately by their families and put them to work on white plantations. Even though the Republicans controlled both houses and were trying to make a change, Johnson vetoed every Reconstruction Act Congress passed. Just vetoed, vetoed, vetoed. And for folks who don't know, you need, I think, 2/3 vote to overcome a veto. Congress, they passed the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which created an institution where freed people, which was the name of former enslaved people, could get resources and help and mediation, etc. And Johnson was trying to just get rid of that. They also tried to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Before the 13th Amendment, generally the federal government didn't have the power to go into states and do such really on the ground stuff. But the idea was that we need to fix this post-Civil War mess. And so the first 2 years of Reconstruction, presidential Reconstruction, nothing solid could get passed over Johnson's veto. But he overstretched and he ended up losing power. So during the first stage, Johnsonian Reconstruction, there were a handful of radical Republicans, radical as in, let's give land to the freed people. Thaddeus Stevens, there's this statement he makes where he says the whole fabric of Southern society must be changed, and never can it be done if this opportunity is lost. How can Republican institutions, free schools, free churches, free social intercourse exist in a mingled community of lords and serfs? If the South is ever to be made a safe republic, let her lands be cultivated by the toil of the owners. So the tensions are rising between legislative branch and the executive branch. And they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which continued the Freedmen's Bureau that had been set up during the war. It was Civil Rights Act. And Johnson vetoes it in the face of increasing violence. So the Klan was formed in 1866 in Pulaski, Tennessee. The period from 1865 to 1867, the violence of the Confederates, who were still in power everywhere. 2,000 Black people were murdered at Shreveport. The 1866 Memphis Massacre, where 400 Black women were raped by the police. Thousands of homes were burned. Congress was like, this has got to stop. This has got to stop. Congress enacts what's called the Military Reconstruction Act. And this is important to understand because the word Reconstruction is actually a verb. Under the Military Reconstruction Act, in order for the former states that were previously in rebellion, the Confederate states, in order for them to rejoin the Union, they needed to reconstruct themselves. They needed to be reconstructed, which required that they had a new constitutional convention where Black men would also participate in defining the state constitution. They had to allow Black men to vote, and they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. So in order to come back into the Union, you had to do those things. So Johnson's last gasp was him going off about how Congress has never provided economic relief for our own people. Giving aid will teach them they don't have to work. He vetoes this Civil Rights Act, and it's enacted over the president's veto, and Johnson no longer has political power. So here we're entering stage 2, congressional Reconstruction. So the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867 is why the period's even called Reconstruction. Again, the purpose of Reconstruction is the states had to be reconstructed, rebuilt in order to join the Union again. And until then, they were like in a state of the military is here and you're under military rule until your state is reconstructed. And when it's reconstructed, it can be admitted back into the Union. Okay, so it's a way that Reconstruction is almost like a verb in this situation. So the 14th Amendment was enacted in July 1868, and by the end of 1869, all former Confederate states had new constitutions, new interracial governments, and were readmitted to the Union. Blacks began serving on juries, and it could be a Black postal worker. And ultimately, there were more Blacks in political power at the state level and in the South and the federal level than there was. That wouldn't occur again until I think it's 1990. Let me bring it down to an example of what was happening on the ground in one state. I'm going to focus on South Carolina here for a minute. In South Carolina, as they're reconstructing their constitution, they say that everyone who was in political office before the war and took an oath to uphold the U.S. Constitution were barred from voting forever. And in the 1868 election, the lower house was mostly Black and the upper house was half Black. So social programs were created at these state conventions in all of the states. Public education, people decided that that is something that the state should provide. And they were trying to do land redistribution. So they were very, oh, you ex-slaveholder, you didn't pay your taxes. We're now taking your land and redistributing it. In 1869, in South Carolina, a Black militia was formed with the help of the federal government. This is kind of close to me because my great-grandfather was in the black militia. It gave the ability to form militias to suppress insurrections and resistance. At this point, we're talking about the Klan and white nationalist violence. The black militia was integrated. There are also white people too who were like, yes, I support you. This is horrible. There were 90,000 black people who joined, 11,000 given breech-loaded, state-of-the-art weapons from the federal government. Before the war, black people couldn't even own drums. You might communicate some secret revolt. 10 years later, blacks were filling the air with drum rolls and brandishing rifles, courtesy of the government indebted to armies that had recently reduced a good deal of the South to scorched earth. White planters in South Carolina were forced to deal with local officials, such as sheriffs, judges, DAs, who responded to black complaints. Vacancy arrests were disallowed because that violated the 14th Amendment. If you tried to use corporal punishment against your employees, you were punished. And taxes were used to fund public education, the first time in American history. Thank Reconstruction for public education. The next step in congressional Reconstruction, they talk about 3 Reconstruction amendments that really fundamentally changed the Constitution. Before these Reconstruction amendments, the Constitution was a slave-holding document. It was a affirmative action for slaveholders. What dismantled that were the Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments. Okay? So we've talked about the 13th and the 14th. Now the 15th was about the vote. So there's increased Klan and paramilitary violence designed to prevent freed people from voting. There's so many documents where women are like armed and escorting their men to the polls so that they don't get killed, and also to make sure they vote Republican. In the 1868 elections, the Klan terror decimated the Republican vote in the South, and they started shifting again back towards, a full-on white supremacist state. It was decided that the black vote had to be constitutionally protected. And so the 15th Amendment was passed, which says, Section 1, the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Just as an aside, this is a fascinating time because there were people really advocating, like Frederick Douglass, for women getting the vote. And so there were people who were like opposed to the 15th Amendment because it didn't include women. And then there were people who were like, well, let's take what we can get, and so finally this was the compromise. And women don't officially get the vote till the 19th Amendment, which is in 1920. Unfortunately, because of the end of Reconstruction, really black people in the South don't have the vote until the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which just got dismantled by the Supreme Court, which gutted the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment is now pretty useless. So it was approved and adopted in 1870. What brought about an end to Reconstruction? What happened in 1877? What happened was something called the Tilden-Hayes Compromise. There was a Democrat and Republican, and there was a conflict between the popular vote and the Electoral College, that evil thing. And so they made a compromise. The white supremacists of the Democrats were like, we will give you the White House if you remove the Union Army from the South. The Republicans were like, we will take the White House and we'll also take our army because we'd actually like to use it in our move towards Western expansion and genocide of indigenous people. And so if you look at the timing of this Western role of genocide, you'll see that a lot of it is post-Reconstruction because the Union Army is now free to do that. They were quite fully occupied trying to keep people from being murdered and enforcing the laws in these states that had been yet to be reconstructed. So 1877 is the end of Reconstruction. The next period, which I'm not going to talk about here, just look out for, is the period after Reconstruction was called Redemption. Redemption for who? For the white supremacists, right? So think that Birth of a Nation film that came out in 1915, the whole idea of like the black man is rapist of white women, it gets created out of whole cloth. Post-Reconstruction is all this part of this thing that Black history specialists refer to as the nadir. I don't think there's another term yet for it. So when I teach it, I call it the period formerly known as Redemption, kind of like the artist formerly known as Prince. I'm not going to go in there and say this is redemption. So why is this relevant today? I've been talking about we need a new Reconstruction. My current book that just came out, it's actually my father's book that he wrote in 1948, where he basically says that Reconstruction was the last chance. And now the only choice is revolution. So he says specifically, is there any prospect for the achievement of such drastic changes within the frame of existing conditions? Of a state dominated economically and politically by finance capital? The bourgeoisie, which would not carry through this land reform during Civil War and Reconstruction, when capitalism was comparatively youthful and waging a progressive struggle against slavery, will surely not carry it out today, when capitalism is in its decadent imperialist era, and monopoly capital seeks to make use of the most backward feudal elements in the interest of untrammeled exploitation. The transformation of the agrarian structure of the South will not come from above. On the contrary, the real economic rulers of the South and the federal government, which represents this concentrated power of big capital rather than the interest of the people, can be counted on to use their maximum strength to crush any attempt at fundamental land reform in the South. It's a little heartbreaking because I think they're right. Because right now we have a white supremacist government. And so in order to even sit down and have a beautiful bottom-up Reconstruction, what do we want our priorities to be as a state, a locality, however we figure it out, right? None of this can be done before abolition. And by abolition, I don't mean just abolition of the carceral system. I'm talking about colonialism, imperialism, white supremacy, patriarchy. These structures have to go. So now we are at revolution. And so if we're going to talk about a new Reconstruction, I think unfortunately it is something that has to be done after these systems have been fully dismantled. But I think we can start now. We're starting now. Even in West Oakland, some bottom up, let's figure this out. The rest of the stuff is burning down. At this point in history, there's no way to achieve what we want without being internationalists, right? The structures we confront, colonialism, slavery, white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism, are fundamentally global, and so too must abolition be. And it has to be grounded in transnational solidarities. Thank you for watching our Reconstruction 101 video and engaging with this topic. Thank you for being a Patreon subscriber. Your support funds our Freedom School here in West Oakland and directly impacts our ability to keep this project going. Follow me on Blue Sky and TikTok if you want to hear more educational videos like this, and our next video will be coming soon.